which is why all of you have joined today. Everybody expressed an interest in, learning more about good practices for mentoring, and many of us have experiences, and some of us are, gaining new experiences with mentoring. So the outline for this morning, I'm going to begin by introducing Jamaine. Some of you may be familiar with him and his work, and some of you may not be. So we'll do an intro, and then we have some predetermined questions for him. And then we also have a framework for the paper. So hopefully all of you have been able to take a look at the paper. There's a link in the chat for the paper. So if not, you can pull that up and access it now. So Jamaine got his PhD in biochemistry and molecular biophysics at the University of Pennsylvania. I actually met him quite a few years ago when we were postdocs in San Diego, long time ago. He is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Biochemistry, Cancer Biology, and Neuroscience at Meharry Medical College. And he's also a member of the Center for Structural Biology at Vanderbilt University. He is a pioneering scientist at the intersections of biophysics, health disparities, and community, which is a really cool kind of, multidisciplinary area of research. When he joined Meharry, he recognized that there were two major gaps in medicine that contribute to health inequities. The first gap is the lack of integration between structural biology and health disparities. So his work focuses on defining the molecular basis of aging and age-related diseases. And he also seeks to understand how the mechanisms of genetic variants, which are usually identified from patient samples, can impact three-dimensional structure and functions of proteins, which I think is super cool. And then also how that contributes to human disease. His work is really focused on aging-related diseases like cancer and Alzheimer's, things like that. The overall goal would be to develop novel and precise treatments for these diseases. Another major gap that he's identified in his work is lack of diversity within clinical and research trials. And I think many of us are familiar with this, but he probably knows it a lot more than us. So his recent work with COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy, which of course is a big thing in the US, revealed that the public wants to know the science behind the vaccines and viruses, but in simple terms. So this information has to be simple and clear and come from a trustworthy and reliable source. In turn, the public can then be able to make more informed decisions and improve their own health outcomes for their own self, as well as within the community. Beyond this innovative research, he's also deeply committed to mentoring and promoting diversity within STEM fields, which is why we're super happy to have him join us today. And he actively engages in community outreach, inspires the next generation of underrepresented scientists, and he's a big advocate for greater inclusivity in scientific research. So welcome, Jamaine. Thank you for joining us today. So you have recently co-authored this fantastic article, How to Be a Great Mentor, which is an acronym for a framework. And I thought we could get started by just asking you some questions.
That's perfectly fine. Thank you. I'm happy to be here. It's great seeing you again, Dior, as well as Arif. And thank you for having this space, because I think spaces like these are critically important. And then part of that, I think what they call hidden curriculum, because we don't really have this in our training. And so a lot of times we're just doing the best. Well, we're all doing the best we can, but without a lot of guidance. And so having this is an important first step in the careers of many future PIs. Yeah,
absolutely. So what inspired you and your colleagues to write this paper?
Well, there's been a surge of, I think, people reflecting and seeing basically bad mentors. Because, those are the ones that are highlighted, right? Like, it's one thing to know what mentoring is and how it works for you, but there have been a lot of cases. Maybe it's because of social media, but we're starting to see, or we've seen or heard that there are a lot of cases that it's not an ideal mentoring relationship, and part of that is because one, we are promoting diversity in all aspects of it, diversity of thinking, diversity of demographics, diversity of disciplines. But when you put all those together, the standard mentoring kind of that happened, back in the day is not sufficient to be effective mentoring today. So as our demographics, as our groups change, so too does the mentoring kind of plan change. And when you think about kind of what it takes to be a good mentor, there's some things that people just automatically do because they've had experience. But if you've never mentored someone before or didn't have great mentoring, it's kind of tough to figure out, how to make it work. And so this paper was actually brought up with my colleagues at Meharry to write this out, providing this type of framework, which can be customized and adjusted to anyone's, mentoring plan and perspective. But it hopefully highlights some of the things that are done that people don't talk about. There are some mentors that actively go out and seek opportunities for their students or for their trainees. But, the hard part with graduate school and postdoc and these training experiences is that it's really hard to normalize them. And so one of the key things in normalizing them is to, one, have a great relationship with your mentor. But that takes work. And sometimes, sometimes it's hard to really decide on choosing a mentor, right? Because sometimes we seek mentors for their science. Sometimes we seek them for who they are as a person, because we've heard they mentored someone well before. So we were trying to capture, as much as we can and generalize and capture that and provide that as a framework.
Yeah.
So I thank my co-authors for working with me on this.
I think that totally makes sense. I mean, I know several of us, that might be adjacent with HHMI labs or other things with training, they have that entering mentoring book, but it's really old and it's a big book. And to me, I think this is just such a great, accessible, list of items, which, hopefully we'll get into when we break that great model down some more. So yeah, I think very timely. I would agree with that. So I have another question for you, kind of piggybacking on that. Which I think, you mentioned how things have changed over time because of our scientific culture and communities and things changing, but also as we personally, go through these systems over time, because training takes a lot of time. So have your personal experiences as a mentee and now a mentor as well, probably also still a mentee, been the same or different?
Yeah. Yes, you'll always be a mentee in some capacity.
You'll always be a mentee.
Because that's just the way the culture is. And it's important to recognize that. So I guess I'll answer that part first. It's important to recognize that because you constantly need to seek out people that will have your best interest in mind and will help guide you to the next phase of your career. And so that can be across industries, whether it's pharma, government, or even academia. And I've definitely changed as a mentee. I have to admit that I realized the impact of mentoring way before graduate school. And so I actually probably would not have done a PhD if it wasn't for a woman named Jackie Tanaka, who encouraged me to pursue a PhD. So I did chemical engineering undergrad, and there weren't a lot of mentoring research opportunities back then. And so I had to really figure out, how to get the research experience that I wanted. And so I did like a self-defined post-bac program, and then with the guidance of Jackie Tanaka, applied to graduate schools and got into graduate school. But in that time, before that, I mentored high school students. And so that was a challenge, because I was like, well, I'm trying to guide these people's, these young people's careers. What am I doing, right? Like, how am I really going to make an impact in the lives of these kind of young, bright people? But a lot of times mentoring can just be seeing a person that looks like you, talking to people. Sometimes people need to vocalize, like, what are their challenges and limitations, fears and intimidation, because it can be intimidating to go through scientific training. And so my perspectives then were a little small. I didn't really know what it took, except listening. I feel like one of the key things that is important for mentoring is listening and really getting to know the mentee. But it depends on, what you define of that relationship. So as I evolved in mentoring more people, I started to really make sure we were on the same page, right? So what are your expectations of this experience? Well, these are my expectations, right? And so making sure at least we're on the same page, so that all the activities and things that I give or steer your way are in support of your ultimate goal, whatever that is. So I also would say that I often ask what the ultimate goal is, right? So when I've mentored, I also work in a variety of other capacities as well. But one of the things that I think is important is to set those expectations up front. And I even tell students now that are in my research course, the medical students, when you approach people, try to define what you need from them, right? And so I would like to do research under you to learn XYZ. And that could be a starting point, but as you evolve or progress, it can change accordingly. And once you kind of define that kind of, or commit to that mentoring relationship, I think it's important, and this is one thing that has changed in my mentoring, is to cater the mentoring to the individual and not have like a blanket mentoring plan where this is how it's always been done. And so, but you can still use the framework, right? Like, you can still use the framework as a guide. But the different types of opportunities that you present to each, or there can be different types of opportunities that you present to each student. I think definitely back when I was in graduate school, most students had to hide the fact that they wanted to go to industry. So they were like, oh, I'm considering different options. But now that's not the case. But now it's even difficult, because how do we actually prepare students for a career in industry? Because I've seen people who have applied to multiple positions in industry and got like no callbacks and just no leads in that area, people that I thought that were very well qualified. So I think that one of the things that I felt that I need to do is figure out how to prepare students for a career in industry. And so those type of things, I think those resources are what I seek out to have for the students and trainees that I mentor.
Yeah.
So I've changed by seeking out, finding out what opportunities are out there and what the culture and climate is like, right? Because it shifts, it changes every now and again. So I've done kind of some of the legwork on my end so that I can, properly provide good resources for my trainees.
Yeah, that kind of self-direction, which I think you also mentioned in the paper, as one of those attributes for mentees. So I think one of the keywords you also used, was that intention. And so with that, I think it'd be a good time if everybody wants to throw in the conversation today, this webinar, what you're hoping to learn or discuss or know more about with respect to mentoring. So if you all want to put just a quick sentence or keywords, use the chat to do that, to share with everybody in the group. Okay, now I want to get into the paper a little bit more. We also have some questions from the community as well, but I want to still focus on the paper for a little bit. So in the introduction, you all mentioned many different models of mentoring. So traditional, like mentor-mentee, which I think is how a lot of us, typically think of immediately for mentoring. Casual or informal mentoring, peer mentoring. I know we have a lot of that here at Iowa State with our students. Reverse mentoring, shadow mentoring, and distance mentoring. So all of these modes of mentoring, I think, are outlined as being intentional, which means that, they're, as you say, deliberate, planned, and purposeful. One thing I wasn't as familiar with compared to some of the other modes was reverse mentoring. So I was curious to know, is this something that you have experienced or your co-authors have experienced, or are there particular scenarios, either in academic spaces or industry or other career realms, where this could have a big impact?
Yes, I think but it's also, so it's important to also recognize kind of what that entails. So it's not always common that a postdoc has more experience in something than a PI. But in some cases, some postdocs have more DEI experience, so they understand more about inclusivity. And that can be a kind of reverse mentoring. For those PIs that are intentional and want to improve, if they recognize there are a lot of people, there's a lot of activism going on these days, that can be a way to kind of reverse mentor. Because we typically think of it as kind of mentoring, I don't want to say down, but from like a level of a PI or senior faculty member down to a trainee. But there are different types of mentoring. And one thing that I would also say is you need all of these mentoring styles, right? Like you really need, and that can encompass, obviously it's going to be specific to what you hope to get out of it. But what we've learned is that more people are accessible over the past few years, and there are a lot of people willing to serve as distance mentors or even peer mentors. And you're I guess a committed mentor may not serve all the roles you need. And so you as a aspiring scientist, I guess, PI or whatever your goals are, you need different types of mentoring because not everyone's going to serve that one role. We typically thought that mentor should serve that one role, but they don't. And so having multiple types of mentors are really important. I would also give an example of reverse mentoring from the community work that I've been doing, right? Because dissemination and interacting with the community has been so one-sided because scientists go out into the community and they get all this data, you get this information, and the community is felt, and then they never disseminate it back to the community. And then the community feels used. So then they're less inclined to participate in some things. So they lose trust. So for me, reverse mentoring is sitting down and listening to the community, hearing their concerns and talking about, one, validating them, not dismissing any of their concerns, but also validating that, we can work better to improve this. And then the community has the ideas that would help or work with their community. So coming in as an outsider, I can't tell that community how best to be a community. right? And so I have to sit back and listen and hear what works in that community. And that has been invaluable because ultimately it leads to improved understanding and overall, hopefully, improved health outcomes.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. The community part of it is not something that I immediately thought of, but now that you mention it, especially for plant scientists, where we have a lot of issues that I think are community hotspots, related to climate change and related to genetically modified organisms and agricultural practices, things that are really hot button issues. That could actually be something where reverse mentoring would be a big part of our community, or could become a bigger part of the community. Of course, you get the opportunity with being, adjacent and right in clinical research to kind of do that in the patient space, which I think is really cool as well. Yeah, I think I wholeheartely agree that you need all of those different sorts of mentoring relationships. They continue throughout your career. Personally, I have also, seen the same thing as well. Totally agree. Okay, so a couple other key points from the paper. We already mentioned this before. Motivation is a big factor that drives good mentorship as opposed to like poor mentorship. Makes sense. If we're, motivated to do something, we're going to try to do as best of a job as possible. But I think the other key point is that it's not instinctive necessarily, and it's not something that we just inherently know. It is a learned skill. So it's something that we all need to continue to develop and work on. And so I wanted to get into your GREAT model, which is the acronym G, give opportunities, open doors. I think you highlighted that a little bit with trying to get, those that were interested in switching to industry careers a foot in the door there, and how that might be different from opening doors in other ways. R, reach out to students to help them identify their strengths and reach their goals. E, encourage them by serving as a positive example. And A, advise each mentee as an individual. And T, train for independent thinking. So I love all of those different action items. I think they're all really good. Do you have anything in particular with those that you think kind of are, most difficult to kind of really do, or
Yes, definitely the reach out, right?
yeah.
I as you were talking, I think senior faculty, the culture of science, to be inclusive, we need to really think about the type of people that are coming into science. And as you were describing that, I had an idea that I don't know, sometimes you need to make it specific for a demographic or a group. Because there's some nuances in different areas that we are not aware of. And one thing that just came to mind, and is probably pretty popular in science, are introverts. Not everyone knows how to network. Not everyone's comfortable networking. But that's part of the game, right? That's part of the culture.
Yeah.
And so we need to provide spaces for people to thrive, right? Like we really need to find spaces for people to be comfortable with who they are and thrive in this environment. But not everyone's going to reach out, right? So I actually recognize a couple of my students who are introverts. And I said, you need to give this talk. Well, of course, I have a good enough relationship to kind of say that. But I recognize that they're shy and timid. And that can come across differently with different people. But part of reaching out is sitting down with the student or the trainee and really discussing the strengths and their strengths and weaknesses, and really describing the path or describing the process. So I just had a student who worked in my lab a couple of years ago, he just texted me. He had an interview for an internship, engineering internship. And I said, listen, you're going to have to smile a little more. and be a little outside your comfort zone so that they can see that you're a great person. And so he just texted and said it went great.
Yep. Yeah, especially if it's a Zoom interview or,
right.
any other kind of web-based thing. It can be really hard to feel comfortable or to come across in the right way. And yeah,
especially if you're not used to it, right? Like,
yeah.
and I told him, I said, listen, I know you are an engineering major. No offense to the engineers. But I know that, people have, people function differently, and some of our characteristics can be seen as dismissive or not interested or whatever. But it's hard you don't want to waste this opportunity to try to see if you can slightly adapt just to get it, just to win an opportunity. Right. And so I'm glad his went well. But also sometimes people just need that encouragement, right? Like, he was very nervous. This was his first interview. And so he was pretty nervous. And so I reached out and said, hey, if you need help, let me know. So it can be as simple as that. I do realize people are very busy, and that's not always the case. And but you want to kind of make that effort to get to know your trainee in some way, because that can help alleviate some of the anxiety that goes with, interviewing and moving on, but also demonstrates, the sincerity with what you kind of take in helping them reach their goals. And so that, that is not something that is straightforward or easy, but it's something that I think would be really important, and maybe and obviously will differ based on the trainee.
Yeah, absolutely. I know with grad students in my group, I've experienced, even I've one postdoc, mostly grad students, and trying to sort of hone in what each student needs, as they prepare for those big things, whether it's interviews or their exams or writing, and each person needs different strategies. It's across the board. Not everything's going to work for every person. And even just strategies of like, how do I get through this interview, or how do I prepare for it? Or, they really do need, different things to be brought out. Yeah.
And I try to, and I know sometimes they listen and sometimes they don't. But I'm pretty straightforward, as you know, and sometimes I would say you need to get your act together, right? Like sometimes sometimes you have to step back and say, listen, this is what's happening. These are the possible situations. You need to handle it accordingly, right? Like as long as you're okay with that, then you so be it. But for the most part, sometimes students or trainees need to hear from different perspectives as well. So I often tell students, like, if you don't believe me, see what your other friends at other schools are doing, right? Like, I'm not making some of this stuff up. I truly believe that you have the potential, but you have to do things in a certain way at this point in your career to make it to the next phase of your career.
Yeah, I agree with that too. Sometimes those leaps need to really happen. I have a couple other questions, and then I think we'll have lots of good time for all the questions in the chat and a few other ones prepared as well. So getting back to one of the thoughts of like, one size doesn't fit all. We need to tailor, yet we also need to define our own mentoring styles, right? A lot of times, especially as we're interviewing for positions or we're considering talking with potential trainees and people might ask, or you might want to articulate what your mentoring style is like and what your philosophies are, what the lab culture is going to be like for those that decide to come. So I wanted to know personally how you define your mentoring style and how you first kind of started to define it. Was it during your postdoc and your independent position? Just out of curiosity.
A good question. I don't know how I would define it. I I make sure I understand what the student wants to get out of it, what the trainee wants to get out of it. So I'm not afraid to have difficult conversations. So if it's not working out, I'm going to say, hey, what's going on, right? Has your goals changed? Have things changed? And I sincerely look out for the careers and the I guess overall happiness of my trainees. I don't want them to be miserable, but I want them to learn. I don't want them to go out in the world and have a different perspective of what's expected of them. So I try to be as transparent as possible, with also, giving them the opportunities to do well. It's very hard for me to give up on trainees, because I think that we just need to, there's some balance somewhere in between, but we need to communicate to understand what that balance is. Mm-hmm. What is it that you need from me? Because this is what I need from you. And I let them know, and it depends on the level. Graduate students is one thing, but I also have medical students and undergrads who come through the lab, and the currency for them are letters of recommendation. And I say, well, what do you want me to put in your letter? Right? I mean, you're here a short time. What is it that you want me to put? And I think hopefully when they think about that, it helps maybe provide some sort of context in terms of, they need to provide evidence or things for me to talk about. And so I give them examples, particularly for the med students and undergrads, about, coming, staying late, going above and beyond, mm-hmm. setting yourself apart from the others in the lab, those type of things. And basically you get out what you put in. So I don't know if I answered your question, because I think more of I'm all over the place with my mentoring because I get so many types of mentees. Yeah. But it's really specific. My success is if they obviously they do well, and they're happy. Yeah. I've had a couple of them come back to me for advice, and that is touching, right? I had one student come back, and he got a full ride to 2 different universities, and he couldn't decide because he felt intimidated. And I typically don't tell people what to do, but for this one I said, you need to go to this school. But part of what he was saying, he was leaning towards it. He just needed affirmation to, and so he went to that school, and he's doing very well. But yeah, I mean, it can be challenging, but for me, I pay attention to those type of things. You're still there. Oh, I guess we lost her.
Yeah, it looks like something happened to the internet. Jamaine, it was very nice to have you with us today. I probably go ahead by the time Dior is back. So one of the things we're talking about the mentoring, like during your career, like what sort of mentoring problem you observed, and on that condition, like what do you think the effective solution from your point of view?
Yeah, so one of the hardest ones that I've observed is is not being motivated. So I had a student who wasn't coming in and just wasn't motivated. So I had to pull him to the side and say, hey, maybe this isn't the lab for you. having that difficult conversation and realizing that it's not me. Like, I don't take that personally, but I don't want to waste your time or mine. So I can't motivate a student no matter how hard I try, right? Like, no matter how hard we try, that motivation has to be internal. And it's fine if you're not interested in biophysics, right? I understand. But you need to figure out kind of what motivates you. So you need to spend the time to do that. So students who are unmotivated are probably the most challenging. We also have students, I've also had students who've had personal problems and things that they had to overcome, whether it's imposter syndrome or various things. And so one of the challenges is knowing that balance between allowing them the time to figure things out. You know that academia is a intense and can be a fast moving place. But part of doing well is having the mental wellness to do well. So sometimes knowing when to take breaks or knowing when to like allow students to take breaks, and also just I guess figuring out how to make it work if things change. If students don't talk or communicate, then that makes it difficult as well. And sometimes, I understand sometimes people are intimidated and they're afraid to have these conversations, but that's the best way to make it beneficial to everyone. So students who are unmotivated or don't communicate, that's typically where there's the most problems.
So Jamaine, there is a question in the chat that we are currently in a mental health crisis for the undergraduate, graduate student, and postdoc. But once they go to the job market, those requirements to get those jobs is kind of similar. So how to make a realistic expectation in this scenario with the mentee?
That's a hard question to ask, and that's dependent on what you're willing to provide for the student. So I definitely agree. There is this shift in kind of the way we're doing things, and mental health is becoming becoming at the forefront of science. I would say I'm different. I know that part of the culture of science is to go out, give all these talks, keep yourself busy, make sure that every minute of the day you're doing something. I don't do that because I said they're not going to kill me. That adds a lot of stress. But when I need to handle the stress, I know how to handle the stress. I feel that that's what I need to impart in my trainees. Now, granted, you may miss out on things, but so what, right? Like, I think you need to define what your success is and don't compromise who you are as a person. And I went through a period where I was struggling, trying to maintain. And I said, you know what? I'm not going through this. Right? Like, I don't care if you don't invite me to give a talk. I do care that you guys did though. But but for the most part, I had to define my own culture of what I would deal with. Now, again, because that's not the norm, you may not get opportunities or people may look at you differently, but who cares? I'm not in it. Obviously, I'm definitely not in it for the ego and the clout. I'm in it because I love science. I love thinking. For the most part, I won't say I love writing grants. I like the idea of writing grants. But I had to set my own terms and deal with them accordingly. So I don't get burnt out, because I was burnt out for a while. I went through depression. I was burnt out. There was a lot because, they basically throw you in an office and a lab and tell you to get a grant. and you have no guidance or very little guidance, depending on the institution, and you're trying to figure everything out, you're teaching, you're doing all these things, and it's ridiculous. Like, I'm sorry, it's ridiculous. I said, I'm not doing, like, I can't do all this and do it well, right? And so, so that's something that maybe you have to consider, that you technically don't have to do those type of careers. And so luckily I've been able to find my flow. It took a while. I've been able to get, significant number of publications out, grants, teaching, and all that other stuff. But I had to do it on my terms, because I did not want to suffer, health-wise, because I'm stressed about meeting these unrealistic kind of milestones. I hope that answered your question. But I think in terms of maintaining productivity, like communicating that with the student or the trainee, that you don't have to do what everyone else is doing. Everyone else, I guess I won't call out any institutions, but a lot of institutions, faculty have people writing grants for them, right? And when I realized that, I said, that's unfair. But hey, that's the game. If you got the money, you can spend time on something else while that grant is being written for you. And so I said, why should I try to aspire to fit into that, which doesn't bring me joy? Bringing me joy is engaging with students in the community and doing the work that I do. So I do it on my own terms.
Awesome. There is another question from the chat, that you mentioned that you are not afraid of difficult conversation. Any recommendation how we get to that point?
I cannot recommend that. Like, that's just something that I think I was born with, because, or maybe maybe it was my mother, I think, because she was always one, I'm going to write a letter and I'm going to talk to their supervisor, that type of thing. And so that translated into kind of my personality. So when there were the challenges, even when I had an issue with my thesis advisor, I went to him and I said, I need more from you. Right? Like, I was just like, plain and simple, I want to be better and I need you to step up. And he was like, oh yeah, I get it. But it's hard, right? Like, people don't like to hear that, because they internalize it like they've done something wrong. But in my opinion, I feel that no matter what your concerns are, they're valid. And we can talk about it, right? It's not beyond reproach, right? Like, it's like, okay, well, it is what it is, but how do we move forward? And I think, like, if you can frame it in that way, sometimes I just be clear, like, I want to work with you. I think what we're doing is great. However, these are some of the issues that maybe affect my ability to do well. So I guess to answer that, for the most part, it would have to be choose your words wisely.
I see.
It may take time for you to sit back and think about what's the best way to have that conversation. But if it's keeping you up at night, then maybe you need to have that conversation. And this is also where your mentors come in, right? Like, right. You can go to one, if it's with one mentor, you can go to one of these peer mentors or shadow mentors or whoever is in your network. I think the key to success is really defining your support network, and know who to go to for what. I have peers that I graduated my PhD program with, and I still go to them for various things. I don't think I would have gotten out of the program if it was not for them, because there are going to be challenges along the way. But sometimes and I'll admit, I know I'm going long-winded, but I also admit that sometimes I'm wrong. I'm not saying that I'm always right. And when I feel like I'm wrong, I self-reflect, and then I present it to like a colleague, like, what do you think? Am I crazy or something, right? Because I need to know how to move forward, right? But I need to make sure it wasn't me. I'm not the problem. And I think that the more we can do that, probably the more relaxed or at peace we are with and comfortable with who we are. But I guess to tie is to put it broadly, you set those boundaries, right? Like you really learn how to set boundaries, because in some cases people are going to, it may be a case where people are taking advantage or whatever the case, but knowing more about who you are and what you're willing to compromise and what you're comfortable compromising can help, steer that. And not every situation deserves a response, but if you feel it deserves a response, then take the time to process it and chart a course. And I would also say, just be comfortable with whatever scenario. Think of all the possible scenarios or outcomes. And if you're okay with any of those, then move forward. But if you're not okay, then you may not want to have that conversation.
Jamaine, everyone likes that idea to identify what a mentee needs from you, but how we actually identify them? Like, do you have an initial chat with them, ask them details, what they exactly need from you? What is the mechanism for that?
So mentees are coming to you for a reason, right? And you want to know what that reason is, right? Because I think that that's the best way to prepare, right? Like, so if somebody is coming to me, if somebody says, I want to work with you, it's like, why do you want to work with me? Right? Like, because I've had some students who've said, well, I need to do research and it's a requirement. I really want to do it in this, but I guess I'll work with you. Well, that's not going to work with me, right? Like, I want to know, have you read my papers? Like, what is it? Do you want to learn structural biology? Do you want to learn more about Alzheimer's? What is it that you want to get out of this? Because I want to ensure that you get something out of this experience. And so setting those expectations up front become really important. And that differs between a graduate student, an undergrad, a graduate student, and a postdoc, right? So a postdoc, we need to discuss at the beginning what you can work on and what you can take with you. So we need to have that conversation up front, because I don't want to see at the end of your postdoc experience that you want to take my main project, right?
Yes.
Right. I want to help you, but I don't want to give you my stuff, right? So having that conversation, but also having it up front so that as we progress, you have time to work on your specific questions to help springboard your career. So those can be seen as difficult conversations. But the more I know some faculty have like a guidebook that they put through. That could be helpful as well, right? Because that also sets all those expectations that everyone reads, and maybe even have them sign a contract. So there are different ways to kind of prep for these type of situations. Although it can change, it can start one way and then shift to another. But I think keeping the ultimate goal in mind, or objective in mind, is the key. So if your objective is to get a strong letter of recommendation to go to graduate school, then how do we work through this? How do we make this work?
Jamaine, we'll ask one more question, and then I'll give it to Dior to end today's event. So the next question is also from the chat. Like, what strategies can be used to seek feedback on how a mentoring relationship is going from a trainee's perspective? And if the trainee feels that it's not going well, how you can bring it back?
Yeah, so I think, again, transparency. So what are the milestones, right? So if you like, what you said, that if the trainee feels it's not working out, what specifically is not working out? So be specific is it that the experiments are not working? You don't have enough face time with the mentor. I think if you be really specific in terms of what is not working, you can approach the mentor with that. Like I mentioned with my thesis mentor, I said, I need more. I need us to have journal club. I want to understand the field and all this. And so he was like, yes, that's totally my responsibility. I would do that, but he didn't. So what did I do? I went to the group meeting of someone on my thesis committee. So to me, I was like, well, I have a problem I need to solve. He's not going to do it, but there are other options I have. And so I went to one of my committee members who worked on the same system, and I just started attending his lab meetings. So I would suggest that consider all options, think through what you want them to do. Like, it's unfair to go in and say this isn't working without thinking through what's not working or even a potential resolution, right? And so does it mean that it's not working and you want to leave? Because that's a different conversation. Is it not working? Does that mean, is it something fixable? And sometimes you have to think outside the box, right? Like, I still want to work with you, but this is something that I need. But that also goes back to saying, using those other mentors, right? So thesis committee member is definitely a mentor. And so I was able to go and get what I needed, even though it wasn't from my primary mentor.
Awesome.
Thank you so much. I think that we had a lot of fantastic questions, and it was great to hear more about your experiences and your thoughts. And hopefully everybody that joined us today was able to, have at least one take-home message for you in whatever role or capacity you're in, as a mentor and as a mentee. And I think that's totally true, that we will be lifelong mentees ourselves. I know that I personally have several mentors that I rely on so much and have benefited from throughout my career. So Jamaine, thank you very much. And thank you everybody for joining us today. And this will be recorded. So if you want to revisit or reach out again with more questions, please do so. Have a great week, everybody.